Welcome to Teaching for Artistic Behavior and Choice-Based Art Education, History and Origins. I'm Abby Padelbay. Here's how to get a hold of me. This is who I am and what I do. I'm a middle school art teacher. I'm also the Pacific Region VP-elect, and I'm working on my doctorate. Hopefully, I'll be defending my dissertation around this research the week after the NAEA conference, so I'm getting close to the end of all of this work. This quote by Paul Bolin, "A recognition of the past helps to ground and give rich perspective to our current location," is something that really guides my work. I really believe that understanding where we came from helps us to know who we are now, and then also gives us a leg and direction to where we want to be. In this talk, lecture, a couple things. I'm going to be moving my head around, make sure I can see the words and you can see the words. But we're also going to be looking at a brief history of the education in the U.S., how it came to be and why, an overview of art education history, and then a history of tab and choice specifically. Additionally, in person at the conference, feel free to get a hold of me. But also, if you're not at the conference and you have questions or clarifications or to just discuss history, please reach out. I have my contact information listed. I really do want to visit with people about this because I'm passionate about the subject area, and I like talking history. I've got to find the right buttons. There we go. Again, I apologize for my head moving all over. I don't know if you see that, but I see it. The history of education in the U.S. These are very broad, sweeping statements that really do look at complicated, layered, nuanced systems and gloss over them with a giant paintbrush. And so when we're looking about how the US was colonized and the goals that different parts of the country had for the reasons that they wanted education to happen, it sets the stage for educational history and actually educational reforms across the country, and still the impact of some of these beliefs and practices linger in our educational system today. In Massachusetts, the Puritans who settled there were coming over from Europe, having been persecuted for their beliefs, and really wanted to make sure that everybody knew why they believed what they believed. And so scripture reading was really critical, and part of the reason that education was taken so seriously in Massachusetts to start with is they really wanted to ensure that the purpose of them leaving the country, the continent, was continued to be an awareness for the kids that needed to learn how to read the Bible. In Delaware, a lot of Quakers settled there. They had a really balanced approach to working with populations. They wanted to make sure that people had an education, but they also wanted them to contribute to the society. And so they felt that people who were educated could contribute better. And so a lot of times there was a good amount of education, but also the expectation you'd put that education to work. Southern states used education as a leveraging tool to keep classes apart. The aristocratic class oftentimes had tutors, and then it was actually illegal and forbidden for learning to happen for slaves. And so, again, education being used to keep class systems in place and to ensure that the status and the working population commodity at the time was kept in their place. And then the Appalachia region was really a system and a place where storytelling was important. And if you came and you were somebody who was educated, you were actually distrusted in some ways. And so book learning was not as valued as being able to have oral traditions of storytelling. Which brings us into history of art education in the U.S. Again, these are big, broad concepts that are layered. We start to see art education happening in the U.S. starting in the 1700s when we had Catholic missions, where we needed to have skilled labor to be able to construct the missions and the artwork that went in the missions in ways that was meaningful to the Catholic Church. And so Indigenous peoples were educated in art to be able to be skilled laborers. Then we have the art academies, so bringing over ways that art was taught in Europe. Um, there was definitely some things happening in Pennsylvania and in New York, and they really were wanting to make sure that the objectives of the arts and the Students' League um, were ones that were perpetuated. And so it was teaching people, but it was also it was a gatekeeping for who was able to be part of those academies. The World Fairs play a big part of art education history. And so before 1867, which is where I have information starting on this slide, um, England had a very similar issue that the U.S. did end up having in 1867, which was that when all of the goods around the world were put on display, art we came up short. We came up short because our stuff was aesthetically unattractive and did not look polished, and so we had some economic crisis around the fact that we couldn't sell our goods abroad. This was a problem the British had as well, and so the British had developed some systems for training students, and then when we realized that we had the same problem, we went ahead and brought highly qualified, I guess is how you would make it now. We brought people over from England to make that happen, to make education happen for us. Walter Smith ended up being hired because in Massachusetts, it was the first place that art education became legislated. And so anywhere there was a town with more than 10,000 people in the population, they were mandated to have drawing in schools. And so drafting and visual arts for many years were synonymous. So fine arts and industrial arts really were combined in the US for economic reasons. Progressivism happened. John Dewey, forward thinkers, people who wanted to move us out of the education system that had become the standard form for public education, started to take root. Administrative progressives focused on public education versus, furthering private ends, and they wanted to make sure that people had enough aesthetic information to be good consumers. And so vocational arts were also emphasized, and consumers, they really wanted people to be consumers. Oh, there we go. Sorry, pushed the wrong button. And so that led a lot of art education was really helping people to be informed, but also realizing it was vocation. There's a lot of graphic designs and things like that. And then we end up with art education that happens in and around between World War I and World War II, that we had a lot of movement of people in Europe to the US, immigration things, and we actually ended up with people immigrating who influenced art education in the US still to this day. Victor Lowenfeld came over as an immigrant from Austria. He'd been influenced by Sikh. I'm never going to pronounce some of these names right. I apologize. But also Freud came from these same places. And Lowenfeld had passion for teaching people that he felt were marginalized, but also working with child development. And so he really did have a profound influence on art education, creating one of the most widely used textbooks. And then through that, because of education and things like that, and people wanting to take directions, he really didn't want people to interfere with student outcomes. He did a lot of work with special needs. And then there was a 1965 Penn State seminar where there were 5 topics presented. Each of these topics had 2 people writing about the topic and then presenting their papers. One from inside of the field of art education, one from outside of the field of art education. And this seminar started seeds that would change the structure, nature, and direction of art education in the U.S. in the resulting decades. And the players that attended that seminar became major players in the field of art education, um, really shifting the narrative and planted the seeds of the DBAE initiatives. Enter a Nation at Risk study, the study where we had, as a nation, decided to figure out why on earth, as we were doing this race to space, um, the uh, the U.S. was behind other countries in math and science, and so we were technologically running the risk of falling behind as a nation compared to other nations. And so um, we wanted to make sure that people had science and math and all of these distinct disciplines of knowledge. And the founders of DBAE, and the people that were really pushing that as a way of being, were doing it as a reaction to make sure that art education stayed in the schoolhouse, to make sure that it was still a valid, that art education was still seen as valid. And so if we were going to live in a world where you had to be a discipline to exist, we should be a discipline. And what did it mean to be a discipline of art education, so that we could be a standalone and not just a something that was easily removed from schools? And so I think that now, looking back, we can be judgmental of DBAE in some ways. Some people still ascribe to it. I was trained in it. And I have been judgmental of it, but also in the context of educational history and where we were at as a nation, DBAE did a lot of work to maintain us as a profession. And so that's something that I really am grateful for, that we maintained being art education when faced with the education as a whole pushing back and forcing content areas to be distinct, separate disciplines. As we moved into the 1990 Goals 2000, the predecessor for No Child Left Behind was some Clinton era decisions in education. Goals 2000, it created the need for standards. And so the first standards in art education came out in the 90s, and then eventually was revised into the National Core Art Standards that we know and use today in a lot of places, or that a lot of state standards are based on. And those came around in 2004. But this idea of standardization of content and things like that have driven education since the 90s and continues to drive that. And it measurable accountability for content and learning is not going away as it has become such a prevalent industry that is profitable. It's profitable to assess people. And it's still something that now we've like, oh, that's what we do, is we, as a society, we measure things. And so No Child Left Behind, of many of us taught and lived that. And it impacted the way schools and students learned and taught, and how educators worked. And then as we've turned the corner into the 2000s, education really has opened back up into various streams. There's a lot of like idea-driven art, STEM, STEAM, art as research, visual culture, digital art and media, and a lot of best practices have been reimagined and repackaged. And as education tends to cycle in and around and come and go about what is important, more whole child, especially post COVID, looking at social emotional learning, SEL activities, and trauma informed practices really are an important direction that education is again turning into. Something that changed the game in a lot of ways was ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and that has afforded some language opportunities where art is in the basket of goods for states, and how that looks changes by state. And I think that that's still to be seen how that shakes out across education, because it is a lot of more local control and how that rolls out. So there's very brief history of art education in the U.S. It is a lot more nuanced than that, and there's a lot more to it. But that's a summary. So, what makes me qualified to talk about all of these things? So, in my research, let me move my head out of the way. I have done 20 interviews with different people, founders of Tab, next level leaders, influencers, critics. I have been doing this research for 8 years now. As I'm sitting next to my computer recording this, I have a stack of books that um, is probably 2 feet deep of things that I've been researching recently, as well as, I mean, really countless other books and articles. And the interviews that have been transcribed, that's 5,275 minutes of transcribed minutes. Um, and so I've had access to individuals and interviews and data that make what I have to say valid, because I have a data set that no one else has. Um, and that's just to say that this is something that it's relevant and fills a hole in the field of art education as far as a gap in knowledge. So, reminding people what Tab is. If this is like, if you're like, I was here because I wanted to learn history things, and you're just talking about something that I'm sure of, or wherever you're at, the pillars that structure teaching for artistic behavior are the question that what do artists do, the child is the artist, and the classroom is the studio. And then these are the main influences that led into Tab. Again, Victor Lowenfeld really deeply influenced some of our founding members of Tab. His creative and mental play that was published in 1947, the first edition and many successive editions, um, helped art educators move into a child-centered stance. He wanted to avoid interfering with children's self-expression. He did a lot of work with disabled students and Black educators. He really was about humans, and that was part of his training, but also part of his experience as an immigrant. The British infant primary schools also deeply influenced the the Tab movement in some interesting ways. So, if you're not sure what the British infant primary school systems were, is in World War II, we were having there was bombing happening in big cities in England, and there was a lot of fear for children in cities, and so they um, would take kids and push them out into rural areas that weren't being targeted. And so there were small communities that were ending up with a lot of students and an influx of kids that weren't really quite prepared. And they were small schools that might not have been set up for the multi ages that they were coming in. And so some structures were set up so that kids could be absorbed into that system in a way that probably would have seemed kind of like Montessori, where you're having um, kids self-directing their learning or teaching each other learning, or um, because again, resource sharing and having kids come in with different backgrounds and educationally and different roles of expertise, it just was a fit for the culture at the time as a necessity. And this is not necessarily how education in England still is. This is how it was post World War II. Um, if you have been in education in the US in the last 15 years, you've heard probably about Finnish schools, about how Finland does so amazing at education. And in the 1960s, instead of looking at Finland, the US was looking at the British primary infant school system. And so we would be sending educators over to study it and bring back models and see how we could translate what they had into our system. And um, very much like Finland, where their systems and society there don't translate to the US here. Some of those are very hard to put in place and they're not transferable. And so the open education system, open classrooms, that's what resulted out of the research of going over to the British infant primary systems. And so when people were coming back from England, they're like, we could do this, let's try it. And so open education became something that was approached as a way of educating. Roland Barthes was somebody who did some research with that. He had a school where he had a traditional classroom set up, an open education classroom. He had did some different action research things where they would place kids in different classrooms they felt would be best to meet their needs. Um, and so the open classroom movement didn't, I mean, there are still open education classrooms, there are still British infant primary school systems. There are still these things, these remnants that hold on where people are like, this was a good idea, we want to maintain this as a way of education. But for the most part, when A Nation at Risk came out and it became critical to assess where kids were, even though students in open education classrooms were performing as well as their peers in more traditional settings, it became clear that it was easier for administrators and for standardized testing to occur inside of traditional classrooms, and it kind of ended the brief open education um, movement that was the 70s when it was mainly in place. Barth, though, was Pauline Joseph's principal. She worked for him, and she is also one of the main founders of TAB. And so there are Lowenfeld directly influenced John Crow, Roland Barthes directly influenced Pauline Joseph, and so these are deeply connected to the way that TAB happens. Oh, doing it too again. So these are people who also influenced TAB. This is not an exhaustive list, but all of these names really do impact and have impacted people in TAB and the movement of TAB. Peter London, George Zakelli, Project Zero, um, and before Project Zero, Arts Propel, Ellen Winter, Studio Habits of Mind, Lois Hetland, Montessori, Reggio Emilia, John Dewey, Jerome Bruner, Lev Vygotsky, Jean Piaget, Al Hurwitz, David uh, Razor, Abigail Housen, and Victor D'Amico, all really did contribute, sometimes very directly to TAB, in conversations and at dinners, and sometimes through association and learning. But this is not the end. I know some of our next level leaders like Clark Freilich and Clay Gao are also deeply influenced by like Noam Chomsky, and so there's definitely different people who have influenced TAB. Here are the founders. Move my head again. Um, Kathy Douglas. She, if we had to pick one person where we can point all the way back to, Kathy Douglas is the first founder of TAB. She would start teaching in 1972, and by 1974, she really had developed at least the tenet that she believed that children are the artist, and she wanted to know what is it that artists do. And she had a background. Her parents were a scientific family. Her dad was a scientist. He very much spent a lot of time thinking and doing um, theoretical thinking and hypothesizing, and she really did like to observe and study, and she still does. And she became a researcher of the students in her classroom. She became an observer. She noticed what they did and tried to make spaces for them to make art. Her master's thesis work was the foundation that the first book around TAB was influenced by. I think that both Kathy and Diane, who co-authored it with, would say that it was inspired and there were parts used, but it was also very much shaped differently in the end than it had started in the beginning. Kathy remains active on social media. She is very much a moderator and answers questions and is part of the community continuously. John Crow worked in Kathy's district. He got hired on to teach high school while she was teaching elementary in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. And he eventually ended up at Mass Art, where he had a lot on his plate as a college educator, and I think at that part, the department head, and his course load was heavy enough that he was like, I cannot take on one more class, but he had a class that needed to be taught, and so he brought Pauline and Kathy together to help him teach that course. And that course, the first time it ran in the catalog was teaching for autistic behavior. It got corrected. It became teaching for artistic behavior. And he wrote the essay A Long Road to Choice, which is still heavily cited and talks about a transition into a choice-based framework. And that essay can be found on the Teaching for Artistic Behaviors website. Pauline Joseph. So John and Kathy started working together. John decided to present at a conference in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts State Art Education Association conference. And in their newsletter before the conference, he had advertised that he was looking for art educators who felt like they were teaching in non-traditional ways, that they were doing things different than everybody else was doing, and invited them to have a conversation. And Pauline Joseph responded to that, and she showed up. And she had been running what could be very much considered a tab classroom at the same time that Kathy had been running it, but they had not been aware of each other until 1993. And so they used a lot of visuals, and her contribution to what people would consider tab now, if you walked into a tab classroom, is the way the menus and things happen. A lot of that originated with Pauline. By 97, 98, when Diane Jaquith got hired in the Newton City School District, which was where Pauline was teaching, she met Pauline and was inspired by her. Diane had done her master's work at Mass Art, and while she knew of John there, they had not met, but she had been doing work with Abigail Housen, who founded or co-founded the Visual Thinking Strategies. And so she had a lot of knowledge and understanding of how to work with an organization or to create an organization, as Abigail Housen had been working to create the VUE organization, VUE, and I can't remember right now what that stands for. But Abigail Housen's work in creating a movement and then situating it really influenced Tab, in that it helped Diane understand what would needed to take a good idea into a movement. And so Pauline and Kathy had intended to present in New Orleans, and it was then that Pauline backed out but sent Diane to hear Kathy speak. And so that was the first time that Kathy and Diane met, was in New Orleans at an NAEA conference. And in the next few years, they would add the tenet, and it was really Diane Jaquith who added the tenet, the classroom is the studio. And so, as well as realizing that teaching for artistic behavior was an acronym called TAB. And so until she'd put those things together, it was just teaching for artistic behavior. There wasn't the acronym TAB. So, milestones and TAB. This is still an ongoing thing. I'm still checking these things. If you come back to the slideshow and some of the dates have changed, it's because I've remembered that I've not done something or I've been corrected. And so this document I will continue to update as I verify and check dates. That's what a lot of my research work is around. And it's active right now. And so Kathy and John met when they were working in the same district. That's how it started out. They met Pauline, and then they worked and taught at Mass Art. And the course they were teaching was helping teach educators a graduate class at night to help them understand better strategies for teaching. John would help a little bit at the beginning of that class, talking a little bit more about his method of teaching, which was a little more choice-based. And then Diane joined them and they expanded. They got a book published in 2009. It was one of the bestsellers for the Teachers College Press. And part of a class that was going was through Brown University, they hosted the Knowledge Loom. Brown University hosted a website called the Knowledge Loom. This Knowledge Loom was a place where TAB really put their documents about what classrooms could look like, what the philosophy was, a lot of pieces of who, what would make TAB got put on the Knowledge Loom. And it existed, although it doesn't exist anymore, but was archived in 2008 by Clark Freilich, at least the TAB component. It was a website that held more than just TAB. It also had best practices for mathematics and for principles and leading, and connecting some other different kinds of disciplines. I think there were 11 areas that were addressed on the Knowledge Loom, and TAB was one of those 11 areas. 2003, Yahoo groups became a thing. Kathy Douglas's student teacher at the time created the TAB logo and also started the Yahoo group, which was incredibly active. In 2012, the Midwest Facebook group was started. Before it got to 5,000 members, it was turned over to become the TAB Facebook group as a whole, and has continued to expand. In the last few years, TAB has made a conscientious effort to move towards Mighty Networks, as a way of moving off of social media to connect with people who are no longer using that, are not interested. And then there have been additional books published, additional articles made. They had started doing summer gatherings in the early 2000s, and eventually translated into the TAB Institute that happens, I think, starting in 2014. And there's been so many conferences that have been attended, national ones, regional ones, state ones, and some TAB organization, like affiliates, like TAB Colorado holds a conference every year in January. There's the Texas TAB Lab in the summer. I think St. Louis has one. There's TAB Stock up in the Three Oaks, Michigan, serving Michigan and Indiana and Illinois, and that kind of like corner right there. And so there's different areas. I think the Northeast has a summer camp kind of learning opportunity and meetings. And so it continues to grow. In 2016, the NAEA Delegate Assembly recommended to the board an approval for a new interest group called Choice, the Choice Interest Group. This had gone before the Delegate Assembly in 2015 and was turned down when it was labeled the TAB Choice interest group, or at that time issue group, because that was the turning point from moving issue groups to interest groups as well. And what happened with that was that was a kind of a turning point in where we can start to say there's a difference between TAB and Choice, at least where they were not used as interchangeably. And not for good or bad, that's just a turning point worth noting here. Well, way back in the beginning of TAB, the Teaching for Artistic Partnership became a thing. It was just a group of people who decided, and it was Kathy and John and Pauline, and then Diane, and then eventually they incorporated. Nan Hathaway became part of that group. Incorporated, I believe, in 2008. And part of the reason is that as they were starting to do more activities and things, and there was some income coming in from different opportunities and going out, that there was the desire to not run financing through anyone's personal account and to have some structure and accountability for some of those things. And so with that happening, TAB was incorporated. They had gone for, there's just some different things that happened. And so As people started to retire, John retired, Pauline retired, Kathy retired, and then eventually in 2016, Diane retired. And as people started to retire, they realized that they did not necessarily want to do the day-to-day work of TAB, of maintaining the organizational aspects of it, and decided that in 2019 to create a bigger board. And so this is current history right now, and it's still being rewritten. There is an actual president of TAB Inc., and it currently is Jen Ferrari. Doing it again. So, as it became a member organization with a board in 2019, Kathy and Diane worked to help get the board going. Diane really being the first president of TAB, and then moving into transitioning Jen Ranke-Zona, and as the president of TAB, who has just, as of January, transitioned to the past president. So this is recent history. They have the bigger advisory sitting board with these members as participants on the board, and then as advisory, and it continues to evolve. And so they have restructured some. They have a smaller sitting board. They still have an advisory board. I don't have everyone listed here as part of that. But Jen Ranke-Zona is now transitioned to the past, and Jen Ferrari. And Jen are both here at the NAEA conference if you want to connect with them, but are still both people that you can reach out to as well. So, let me move my head again, maybe. We're going to talk a little bit about what is the difference between TAB and choice. Because there is a difference. Maybe I will. There we go. So TAB it's and maybe more than a pedagogy, it's a philosophy. It's the way, the understanding, the underpinnings of the why of what we do, the belief system. And then the actions come from that. And so it's how you frame the belief system about why you do what you do. And so it is a rather binary system has been laid out, that you believe that the child is the artist and the classroom is the studio, and you're exploring what artists do, or that you don't. And it's the why that drives the how of what you do. And then choice is the praxis. It's where your belief structure meets your practices. It's the how of what happens in the classroom. And it doesn't necessarily even mean that you have to be TAB to be choice, but it's a continuum, and there's student directed on one side and teacher directed on the other, and it can slide depending on your situation, the students you have in the classroom, how much support students need, the kind of teacher you are, how many scaffolds need to be in place to support students who have not experienced having choices before, which happens, and can be varied by even classes. Like if I teach, 15 classes, 3 of them might need more scaffolding. So it depends, and you as the educator get to make that decision. There have been times in the past where these were interchangeable, and there have also been times when the interpretations of how these function have been very religiously adhered to, I guess, is what it feels like. And so I think that that's also something that is open for conversation and a debate. But the core of what TAB is that it is believing that the child is the artist and the classroom is the studio, and exploring what do artists do. And choice is how many choices students have to make that happen or not. And And for full disclosure, I am a TAB educator in a modified choice classroom structure. My students are not in a full choice structure. So, John Crow, again, one of the founders of TAB, um, had some really helpful things. I don't know where to put my face on this slide. There we go. um, he had the original and initial continuum of choice. Diane Jaquith and Tom Burkle from Colorado also came out with continuums of choice the same year, but that was many years later. The continuum of choice really originated with John Crow. And he also had kind of a way of seeing how divergent thinking can work and what entry point you might have into education. And so the I do it and then you do it framework of a lot of classrooms that exist of like, I know things and you need to know these things. The I am going to set up a structure and you're going to work with inside of that structure. The I challenge, you wrestle, problem, setting up challenges for students to solve, and then the you choose it and I'll support you model. And so how you move through those kinds of things. That's lovingly referred to as crow's toes. And then this would be the continuum of choice created by Diane Jaquith. And so moving also into what happens in choice when teacher-directed learning and then student-directed learning, when choice can be used as a reward or near full choice. And so those are things that kind of help clarify what the continuum of choice might be. For a while, people would be like, "Oh, I'm modified tab," and the clarification is that you're maybe modified choice, but you're not. There's not a mostly tab or kind of tab. It is I am tab or I'm not tab, and depending on who you talk to, how they feel about that. But that's kind of the accepted way things are at the moment. So, just like every student is different, every teacher is different, tab is going to look different in every single classroom in every single school with every teacher every year. You could be a teacher who's been teaching tab for a long time and you switch schools and it is like starting over. It is okay that it looks different. My tab classroom looks different than other people's tabs classrooms, and it is okay. It is, there's permission there. If you want to know more about tab, you're welcome to check out the Teaching for Artistic Behavior website. This awesome blue button at the top of their website is the Mighty Networks community link. And so if you want to be involved in the conversation or ask questions to people who are not me, which you are welcome to do, that is a great place to do that at. Tab Storytellers, this is a podcast that I co-host. I don't host it myself. I co-host this with Jen Ferrari, again, the current president of Tab Inc. We share it monthly. I believe that we are now episode 11, maybe? I don't know for that far. Maybe 8. I don't know. It just seems like we've done more than what we had on this slide. And so we talk with different people in Tab and ask them about their Tab story. And so we've visited with Kathy Douglas about her story. If you wanted to hear the history from her own mouth, that's one of our early episodes. I would invite you to explore it if you want to know more about Tab from the people doing Tab. These are people who I appreciate and acknowledge and am grateful for in my research and in my journey. And then if you have, again, questions or comments for me and you are not in person at NAEA, feel free to reach out. I would love to visit. So, I'm Hanks. Just kidding. I'll move my face again. Thanks. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. This is the QR code for the slide deck. So if you would like this information, again, if I have date corrections or things that come up where people are like, "Hey, you got that wrong," I'll fix it on here. So if you, or if you're going to cite this, just be aware that you may want to make sure that you have checked this slide deck for the more current information, even from this presentation, because I am a human who can make errors, and I just have done my due diligence in doing as much research as almost physically possible for myself in the amount of time that I've given myself in 8 years, but also that there are ways and shapes and forms that are understood or interpreted differently than I might have interpreted it. So thank you for joining me on this journey through TAB. I hope this was helpful. And again, I would love to hear from you if you have thoughts or reactions or just more questions or would like to know more about where I got some of my information. I hope you have a great rest of your conference.